Welcome to Narangi Adventures and welcome to Lillishall Abbey. Lillishall Abbey is located just a few miles to the northeast of Telford. Lillishall Abbey was founded in about 1148 for a community of Augustinian canons. By the late 13th century, it had become a religious house of great reputation and prestige. In the 14th century, however, a financial crisis contributed to a gradual dwindling of the community. After the abbey was suppressed in 1538, it was converted into a private house. The buildings were fortified during the Civil War and held for the king. They were, however, severely damaged during a parliamentarian siege which lasted for many weeks. However, the extensive sandstone remains still gives us a sense of the former magnificent structure. Visitors are first brought to the western entrance with its wide central doorway and round arch above. The massive stonework either side would have supported the Great Western Tower. This was most probably destroyed during the Civil War siege along with the west window. The remains are still quite imposing, as many of the walls still stand. The church was constructed in a traditional cruciform and stretches over 60 metres in length, once having a great stone vaulted roof. The large impressive east window before us was added in the 14th century and still dominates the church, as it was intended to do. Two screens divide the length of the church. Alas, only their footings remain before the chancel and the presbytery, the oldest parts of the church. As we pass through the second screen into the chancel, looking towards the presbytery, we pass through the crossing of the north and south transepts into the presbytery, where the altar and choir would have been. The eastern window would have almost certainly been destroyed during the Civil War siege. Today, very little of the north transept remains. It may well have suffered greatly during the Civil War. The south transept is more complete and forms part of the east wall of the cloisters. Exiting the church to the south, we enter the cloister, a rectangular area which would have had a covered walkway around it, and at its centre, a garden. To our left, in the east wall, there appears to be a holding area, maybe jail. The abbots of the Abbey would hold court and dispense justice, not always to the true letter of the law, but their own convenience. A contentious issue indeed. Also, to our left, there is a small vaulted passage, which may also have been used as a meeting place to discuss the day's activities. A small doorway leads from the passage to the sacristy, where items of religious and ceremonial value were stored. Exiting once again to the cloister, we pass the charter house where daily prayers and rules of the order would be read out. In its floor, the resting place of former abbots and dignitaries, sponsors and supporters of the Abbey and its order. Continuing on toward the south wall, a passageway leads to what would have been the dormitories and associated domestic buildings, none of which survive above the ground today. The south wall of the cloister would have housed a warming room and the refectory, and at its far end the kitchens. These facilities were placed here to keep them as far as possible from the church, thus preventing the smells of cooking and food reaching it. The west wall of the cloister is almost completely missing, but would have been part of the Abbot's Hall, which would have hosted guests and visitors to the Abbey. On more than one occasion, the King himself. The kitchens, sitting in the corner between the refectory and the Abbot's Hall, allowed it to service both residents and guests alike. Before us are the Abbot's chambers, which were at the rear of the hall and were accessed from it. The main hall would have most likely contained rooms for visiting guests, as well as the hall and necessary offices to take care of its daily running and affairs. A doorway leads out to the cloister, next to what would have been a stone porch, an entrance to the church for ceremonial purposes. Let us now enter the church for the last time, and cross to the last usable tower, climb to its summit, and take one last panoramic view of the remains of Lillishall Abbey. And here we are surveying the ruins. A church, a home, a site of civil war. Now all rest in peace in these ruins. Visitors over many years have carved their names into the stones, the earliest I noticed being 1727, something that today would be frowned upon. Here, however, it lends age to the history of these ruins. Entry to Lillishall Abbey is free of charge, the ruins being administered by English Heritage.